Not sure how often we think about calling God Father, and how perhaps we just, like the words of the Our Father, for example, can rattle off our lips. It can happen so quickly, we don't necessarily take it in. And what we want to be careful about here is we're not ascribing a gender to God, but at the same time we need to take very seriously that Jesus called the name that Jesus gave to the one that he called Father. That there's a significance in that that's inescapable for us as Christians, because if we want to know who God is for us, we look to the person of Jesus to not only tell us that, but also to in some ways embody it. And so it's significant that here we get an insight into Jesus' prayer, that he says, "I bless you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth." That word there that he used is probably, it's a different word in the Greek, but it's probably a translation from the Aramaic that Jesus spoke, which is Abba. And it's not easy to translate that word into English. It's not quite as kind of childlike or childish as daddy, but it's also not father as we think father. Like if I call my dad father, it's usually because I'm wanting to I'm stirring him a bit, I call my dad, So the way Abba is sort of something in there like that. There's an intimacy to it without losing something of its respect. Jesus says, as the passage goes on, no one can know the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son has chosen to reveal him. To be drawn in other words, to the same intimacy that Jesus has with the one that he called Father is an essential part of what Jesus does for us. That we're drawn into the same relationship of intimacy with him, with the Father that Jesus has. It's not different. Because of who Jesus is and because of what he has done for us, it's not that we have kind of like a different relationship, much less a second-rate one. It's the same dynamic, the same relationship. And that's worthy of pause, it's worthy of reflection, it's worthy of contemplation. That we get to share in the same relationship with God that Jesus, the eternal Son, does. In the passage, it goes on, and this is a rich passage, and I want to try and just tease out bits of it for us this morning. It talks about, the translation we have is, unless you become like little children, you won't inherit the kingdom of God. You won't receive, in other words, this revelation of the same relationship that Jesus has with the one he calls Father. Unless you become like children. Now, a better translation there might be, unless you become childlike. And that invites us to think about, what does that mean? And I want to make a distinction between being childlike and childish, because so often, I think today, people in our culture think that religious faith, Christian faith, but also other faiths, are all kind of relics of a bygone era, archaic superstitions, if you like, that we're trying to grow out of and that you leave behind because they're childish. But there's nothing childish about Christian faith. There's a rich intellectual depth, there's a great wisdom, there's incredible spiritual insight, but that doesn't mean that only the learned and the clever can discover it. To be childlike here is not to be childish. It's not to pretend that those things don't have value and significance, the intellectual tradition, the great wisdom and spiritual tradition of our church reflecting upon the mystery of Jesus, but that the doorway into that, the entrance point, the way into faith is to be childlike. And the key virtue here, or the key disposition, the key attitude that we're to take, I think, is the trust of a child. Children trust their parents. Parents who love their kids, create an environment, a context of care, of nurture, where a child grows up and instinctively trusts. And in a healthy family, that never goes away. It provides a foundation for that child's life as they grow up. It's in unhelpful and unhealthy dynamics that where a father or a mother does not offer that love and care, that the child grows up fearful and unwilling to trust or unable to trust. But that's not the way it should be. The love of parents for their child creates a context in which the child's instinctive response and action is to trust. To trust what mum and dad say and mum and dad are asking of them. That's the invitation, I think. That's the kind of childlike quality that Jesus is inviting us into when he says, if you want to know what it's like to enter into that same relationship with the Father that I have, come with that attitude of trust. Come with trust. It means that Christianity is not an intellectual kind of problem to be solved. It's not necessarily a bunch of ideas that we ascribe to, but it's a meeting with a person. It's being drawn into a relationship, and a dynamic relationship that consists of father, son, parent, child. That's the relationship that we're being invited into. That's the relationship that we're being invited to draw into. The other part of that is that you notice in the gospel that Jesus says, he invites us to ask. He wants us to ask. I think there's something really important here about desiring this. That it's not something we just sit and sort of take for granted, which perhaps children can do with their parents, but that if we want to know that dynamic in our lives, that relationship, to ask for it. Show me. Show me that I'm loved like that. Show me that I'm cared for in that way. Show me that you want that kind of relationship with me. To ask in prayer is so crucial and important. And that brings us to the last part of the passage, this beautiful moment where Jesus says, come to me, all you who are labour and are burdened or overburdened, and I'll give you rest. Not sure about you, but as I've reflected on this passage over the last week, and as at many times I think in my life, as I've read it, it feels like a long drink of cold water on a hot day. If I'm feeling the burdens and the challenges of life, if I'm feeling the pressures, to hear Jesus say to me, come to me. Notice that in this moment, he doesn't actually point to his Father. He's not someone who's just a signpost saying, here's the way to God. He actually says, come to me. Come to me if you labour and are burdened, and I will give you rest. So beautiful that that's his invitation, that if we're experiencing a labour and a burden in our lives, to know that we can come to him for a rest, a spiritual rest, if you like, that nothing else can give, that no one else can bring. And then he then takes up the image of a yoke. So he says, look, my yoke's easy and my burden is light. The image here, I think, and it's really important that we get it, you know that it's an agricultural image. You know that a yoke is the wooden kind of piece that goes over animals to make sure that they're easy to control. If you've got a yoke over 2 oxen, for example, it makes it much easier to direct them as they help to plough a field, for example. The idea of a yoke in that is that it makes the animal easier to direct. Jesus' image here is drawing upon, this is an image that was used to describe the Jewish law, that it was a yoke that actually helped direct the people of Israel to follow the path that God had for them. It was also an image of wisdom, that to have a yoke on you was to say, okay, well, this is the wisdom that I'm following, this particular rabbi or sage or philosophical teacher, was to put yourself under his yoke. Jesus is saying, well, here's what my yoke looks like. Now that can sound really funny to us because in our culture we're resistant to any kind of yoke. We think, that part of being adults, part of being free is to make sure that we don't have a yoke over us. But the truth is that we all live according to other authorities in our lives, that we all take wisdom from different places. And the most dangerous thing perhaps is to actually live your life thinking that you don't have a yoke over you. to think that I'm actually the master of my fate and the captain of my soul, without realizing that there are all sorts of influences, all sorts of authorities that I listen to, without recognizing that they're there. And so I think one of the things that we're invited to consider this morning is which yoke we have on, because it's not about whether you have a yoke or not, it's about what yoke you wear. And whether that yoke is actually directing you to life, directing you to the rest that Jesus promises, that's relieving the burden. The image of a yoke could sound like there's a burden being placed on someone's shoulders. Jesus specifically says here that his yoke is easy. The other image that I've had as I've been reflecting upon the passage this week is sometimes I think, I know this is certainly true in my life, is I've said, well, I want the yoke of my life to be the person of Jesus and the way of life that he offers. But there's a part of me that only wants half the yoke, that wants to kind of like, I kind of wrestle against it. I try and kind of think it'd be really nice not to have it always on or fully there. And in those moments I find, imagine a couple of animals and the yoke is not on properly. You can imagine all the difficulty that the farmer has trying to direct the oxen now, because the yoke's not doing what it's supposed to do. And it absolutely feels like a burden at that point. It absolutely feels like a struggle. So often I think people stand on the outside of Christian faith and they think, look at the burden of that. Look at the strict morality, for example. Look at the choices that people have to make in that sort of way. But they don't realize that the yoke's easy if you lean into it. If you allow the yoke of Jesus to lean in, to actually hold and direct and guide you, it's easy. That can only be true, that can only be the case if the yoke that Jesus offers is love, right? That's what Jesus brings. His yoke is love. That's the only yoke he wants to give. And all of the church's moral teaching flows out of the fact that he calls us to love. He calls us to love. Now, there's a sense in which love is hard, but there's also a sense in which love, because we're made for it, even if at times we find ourselves pulled in different directions, the love that Jesus offers, the yoke that he brings, is a yoke that guides us towards love, that directs us in love, and orients us towards love. So as we celebrate Eucharist then together this morning, I think one of the things that we want to really focus upon here first is to recognize that we might be feeling the burden. That at this time, it's been such a challenging few months, and the challenge I don't think is over in so many ways, to recognize that we come today to receive the rest of Jesus, his spiritual rest. How do we come to him? Of course, we come to him in Eucharist. We come to him in prayer. And the key thing here is to be conscious about coming to ask, can I come to you? Will you let me come to you? Knowing that he wants us to, knowing that he welcomes us in. And then to recognize then that we want to allow ourselves to take up his yoke of love in our lives, because that's what we want to direct us and guide us. Not other yokes, which might promise all sorts of other kinds of freedom, but actually can be a heavy burden over our neck. Rather, to receive the yoke of Jesus, which is light and easy, because it's actually the love that orients the world, the universe, the love that God has created us for.